The biting New York City wind whipped down Bleecker Street, carrying with it the usual symphony of urban sounds. The blare of taxi horns, the rumble of subway trains, the ceaseless chatter of hurried pedestrians. But beneath the cacophony, a different melody emerged, a raw, soulful sound that seemed to rise from the very cracks in the pavement. Jonathan Jangles. Riley, a man whose age was etched in the deep lines of his face and the worn fabric of his overcoat, sat huddled in a narrow alleyway. His fingers, gnarled and calloused, danced across the strings of his battered acoustic guitar. A voice, hoarse yet powerful, filled the space, a voice that spoke of heartbreak, hope, and the restless spirit of the city itself. Jangles wasn't always a street musician. Once, he dreamed of filling stadiums, of his songs echoing across the airwaves. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A series of misfortunes, a failed record deal, a broken marriage, the slow, agonizing decline of his mother, had left him adrift, a ghost haunting the city's margins. His guitar, a gift from his father, was the only constant, the only voice that hadn't abandoned him. Today, like most days, Jangles sang for spare change, for the brief flicker of recognition in a stranger's eyes. He sang for the sheer joy of making music, a compulsion as vital as breathing. His repertoire was a mix of old blues standards, forgotten folk tunes, and his own original compositions, songs that were as honest and unpolished as the man himself. Across the street, in the sleek, tinted windows of a black Mercedes SUV, sat Arthur Vance, a man whose life was a stark contrast to Jangles's. Arthur was a titan of industry, a self-made billionaire, a man accustomed to the finest things in life. His world was one of boardrooms, private jets, and exclusive clubs. But today, something was different. Today, Arthur was restless. He'd been on his way to a high-profile lunch meeting, a deal that could potentially add millions to his already vast fortune. But the sound of Jangles's voice, carried on the wind, had stopped him in his tracks. He told his driver to pull over, and now he sat mesmerized, his gaze fixed on the figure in the alleyway. Arthur had always had a soft spot for music. He'd grown up listening to his father's old jazz records, and though his life had taken him down a different path, the love of music remained. But it wasn't just the melody that held him captive. It was the raw emotion in Jangles's voice, the pain and resilience that resonated deep within him. He watched as a few passers-by tossed coins into Jangles's open guitar case. Some paused to listen, their faces etched with a fleeting moment of empathy. Others hurried on, their eyes averted, as if afraid of catching a glimpse of their own potential vulnerability. Arthur felt a strange sense of unease. He'd spent his life building walls, insulating himself from the harsh realities of the world. But Jangles's music had pierced those walls, reminding him of the human connection he'd so often ignored. He watched as Jangles finished his song, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. The applause, if it could be called that, was meager, a smattering of claps that quickly faded into the city's din. Arthur made a decision. He opened the door of the SUV and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The wind whipped at his expensive overcoat, but he didn't notice. He walked across the street, his footsteps echoing on the cold pavement. Jangles looked up, startled, as Arthur approached. He'd seen his share of well-dressed people, but this man, with his tailored suit and confident stride, was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, a sense of purpose that made Jangles feel strangely exposed. "That was something," Arthur said, his voice low and sincere. Jangles shrugged, his gaze dropping to his guitar. "Just trying to make a living." "You have a remarkable voice," Arthur continued, "and your songs, they're real." Jangles looked up, surprised. "Real?" "Yeah," Arthur said. "They speak to something deep." Jangles chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Deep? I'm just singing about being broke and alone." "But you're singing with heart," Arthur said. "That's what matters." A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Jangles looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and hope. He'd had his share of empty promises, of people who'd seen his talent and then vanished. "What do you want?" Jangles asked, his voice guarded. Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I want to help you record an album." Jangles stared at him, his mouth agape. "An album? You're kidding, right?" "I'm dead serious," Arthur said. "I've got the resources, the connections. I can make it happen." Jangles shook his head, a wave of disbelief washing over him. "Why? Why would you do that?" Arthur paused, his gaze fixed on Jangles's weathered face. "Because your music deserves to be heard. Because I believe in you." Jangles looked at Arthur, his eyes searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was sincerity, a genuine desire to help. I don't know what to say," Jangles stammered. "You don't have to say anything," Arthur said. "Just let me help you." Jangles hesitated, his mind reeling. He'd spent so long living on the fringes, believing that his dreams were dead. But now, a stranger, a man of immense wealth and power, was offering him a chance to resurrect those dreams. He looked at his guitar, his faithful companion, the only thing that had kept him going. He thought of his mother, of the songs she used to sing to him as a child. He thought of the years he'd spent honing his craft, of the countless hours he'd poured into his music. And then he made a decision. "Okay," Jangles said, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay, I'll do it." Arthur smiled, a smile that radiated warmth and hope. "Good," he said. "Good. We'll start tomorrow." As Arthur turned to walk back to his SUV, Jangles watched him go, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. He'd spent so long living in the shadows, but now, it seemed, the light was beginning to shine. He picked up his guitar, his fingers tracing the worn strings, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Jangles found himself sitting in the back of Arthur Vance's sleek black Mercedes, a stark contrast to his usual mode of transportation, his own weary feet. The city rushed by, a blur of steel and glass, as they headed towards Arthur's private recording studio, nestled in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Brooklyn. Jangles, still reeling from the previous day's events, stared out the window, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He'd spent years singing on street corners, his music a soundtrack to the city's forgotten corners. Now, he was being whisked away to a world of soundproofed rooms, state-of-the-art equipment, and professional engineers. It was a dizzying transformation, a dream that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Arthur, sensing Jangles's unease, turned to him with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Jangles," he said. "This is going to be a good experience. Just relax and be yourself." Jangles nodded, his throat tight. I'm not used to this," he admitted. "This is all a bit much." "I understand," Arthur said. "But you deserve this. You have a gift, and it's time to share it with the world." The car pulled up to a discreet building, its facade blending seamlessly with the surrounding townhouses. Inside, the studio was a haven of creativity, a world of gleaming microphones, intricate soundboards, and plush, sound-absorbing furniture. The air hummed with a quiet energy, a sense of anticipation. Arthur introduced Jangles to the studio's resident engineer, a young, enthusiastic man named Leo, who greeted him with a warm smile and a firm handshake. Leo's eyes lit up when Arthur explained the project, his passion for music evident in his every word. "This is incredible, Mr. Vance," Leo said. "I've heard Jangles's music. It's got soul, real soul." Jangles blushed, unused to such praise. "Thanks," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the intricate soundboard. "All right, let's get started," Arthur said, clapping his hands together. "Leo, set up the recording booth. Jangles, why don't you warm up a bit?" Jangles picked up his guitar, his fingers tracing the familiar strings. He closed his eyes, letting the music flow through him, a torrent of emotions finding expression in the raw, unpolished chords. He sang a few old blues standards, his voice filling the room, a testament to years of honing his craft. Leo watched, his eyes wide with admiration. "Man, that's powerful," he said. "You've got a voice that can move mountains." The recording process began, a slow, meticulous process of capturing Jangles's music in its purest form. They started with his original compositions, songs that spoke of his life experiences, of the struggles and triumphs that had shaped him. At first, Jangles felt awkward, self-conscious under the glare of the studio lights and the scrutiny of the microphones. He was used to singing in the open air, his voice carried on the wind. But Leo, with his patient guidance and encouragement, helped him relax, to find his rhythm in the controlled environment. They spent hours in the studio, refining the songs, experimenting with different arrangements, and capturing the raw emotion that made Jangles's music so compelling. Arthur, though not a musician himself, had a keen ear for detail, offering suggestions and feedback that helped shape the final product. As the days turned into weeks, Jangles's confidence grew. He began to see himself not as a street musician, but as an artist, a creator of music that had the power to touch hearts and minds. He started to understand why Arthur had believed in him, why he'd invested his time and resources in this project. However, the transition from street performer to recording artist wasn't without its challenges. Jangles struggled with the pressure of perfection, the need to capture the raw energy of his live performances in the controlled environment of the studio. He sometimes found himself second-guessing his own instincts, wondering if his music was good enough, if he was worthy of this opportunity. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session, Jangles sat slumped in a chair, his guitar resting on his lap. He'd been trying to record a new song, a ballad about his mother, but he couldn't seem to capture the emotion he wanted. "It's no use," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'm just not cut out for this." Arthur, who had been observing from the control room, came over and sat beside him. "What's wrong, Jangles?" he asked. "I can't get it right," Jangles said. "I'm trying, but it just doesn't sound the way I want it to." "You're putting too much pressure on yourself," Arthur said. "You're trying to be perfect, but music isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, about expressing yourself." "But I want it to be good," Jangles said. "I want it to be worthy of your investment." Arthur smiled. Your music is already good, Jangles. It's real. It's authentic. That's what matters. But what if people don't like it? Jangles asked, his voice filled with anxiety. What if I fail? Everyone fails sometimes, Arthur said. It's part of the process. But you can't let the fear of failure stop you from trying. You have to believe in yourself, in your music. Jangles looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, Arthur said. You're a survivor, Jangles. You've been through a lot, and you've come out stronger. Just remember that your music is a gift, and you have a responsibility to share it with the world. Jangles nodded, his spirits lifted. He picked up his guitar, his fingers finding the familiar chords. He closed his eyes, and the music flowed through him, a torrent of emotions finding expression in the raw, unpolished melodies. This time, there was no hesitation, no self-doubt. There was only the music, pure and unfiltered. Leo, listening from the control room, gave Arthur a thumbs up. That's it, he whispered. That's the magic. As the recording session continued, Jangles found a new sense of freedom, a newfound confidence in his abilities. He began to experiment with different sounds, different arrangements, pushing the boundaries of his musical style. He was no longer just a street musician. He was an artist, a creator, a voice that was finally being heard. The album began to take shape, a collection of songs that reflected Jangles's journey, his struggles, his triumphs, his unwavering spirit. It was a testament to the power of music to heal, to inspire, to transform. But as the recording process neared its end, Jangles couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He'd poured his heart and soul into the album, but he felt that it lacked a certain spark, a certain raw energy that he'd always associated with his live performances. He decided to take a risk, to step outside his comfort zone. He proposed to record a few tracks live, in a small, intimate setting, with a handful of his friends and fellow musicians. Arthur, though initially hesitant, agreed to the idea. He recognized the importance of capturing the raw energy of Jangles's live performances. They set up a makeshift stage in the studio's lounge, inviting a small audience of friends and fellow musicians. Jangles, with his guitar and his voice, filled the room with his music, his raw, unpolished sound resonating with the audience. The live recordings were a revelation. Jangles's voice, freed from the constraints of the recording booth, soared and soared, filling the room with a raw, unbridled energy. The audience, captivated by his performance, responded with cheers and applause, their energy fueling Jangles's own. The live tracks added a new dimension to the album, a raw, authentic sound that captured the essence of Jangles's music. It was a perfect blend of the polished studio recordings and the raw energy of his live performances. As the album was completed, Jangles felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride. He'd come a long way from the streets of New York, from the shadows of doubt and despair. He'd found his voice, his purpose, his place in the world. And it was all thanks to the music, and to the man who believed in him.